go. This is your Professor Donald Earl Collins for HS 103. It is week 9, so hello, happy week 9. We are past the point of the writing assignment. We're past the point for the freestyle assignment project proposal that was due yesterday, October the 30th. We are now moving fully into the second half of the semester in this course, which includes covering pretty much everything within the lifetimes of baby boomers, Gen Xers, millennials, and zillennials like yourself. So over the last, say, 40, say 70 or 80 years. So that's pretty much what we're doing for the remainder of the semester. But I want to talk to you a little bit about the writing assignment. I want to talk to you a little bit about the freestyle proposal and where things are and what we're going to be doing the next couple of weeks between now and Thanksgiving. And believe it or not, we have to start thinking about Thanksgiving. It's already Halloween. Thanksgiving is 3 weeks away, a little bit more than 3 weeks away. So here we go. So, first of all, I'm almost through with my U.S. history students by making the modern world students 103. I have like 3 essays left to read. I'll probably have them done this evening, but that does not mean that they will be up Tuesday. I have to teach Tuesday. I have to get up at the crack of dawn to get up to Baltimore to teach all day. So, in all likelihood, I will not be submitting those grades until Wednesday. And I will talk to you in more detail about your assignment and how things went on Thursday. I will just say this for, those who are just anxiously waiting for their grades to go up. Most of you did between pretty well and near excellent. Um, by the time curves are calculated, I will be doing a curve for this one because there's a big middle of folks who did okay, not great, not terrible. Um, um, so that most of you probably with the curve will have a grade between 80 and 100, basically, on the assignment. That does not mean grades. This is what people do not understand about grades. Grades are not personal. This is not me personally feeling, trying to offend folks with grades. This is me assessing what you did. You had a writing rubric. You've used that to supposedly do peer reviews back in weeks 5 and 6. So I would imagine that you have some understanding of what I am looking for at this point. Most of you did not do opinion essays. Most of you did not do big picture or big idea essays. Most of you did not do personal essays. Most of you did book reports, or in some ways, very sophisticated book reviews, which is better than a book report because at least you're just not summarizing everything. You're actually adding some context and some analysis. But the truth of the matter is most of you did not do the assignment as it was set up to be done. And as a result, you all lost points. Most of you lost some points because of that. Some of you lost a lot of points because of that. But there were other issues. There were a whole variety of other issues that I will get into a lot more detail come Thursday. Um, Let me just say, though, that some of you will be surprised, and not necessarily for the better by your grades because you didn't meet deadlines. Some of you tried to, because, you assume that because I can't remember your name on the spot, that I can't, see when you haven't handed in something by the deadline, and then 10 hours later it's there and you don't say anything. That's kid stuff, to be perfectly honest. And sneaky kid stuff at that. I did, as soon as I got up Monday morning, I looked at who had handed in what and where things stood, and immediately had to respond to emails for people who had submitted their assignments as drafts and not for grading. And to reassure them that as long as they got it in by the 11:59 deadline, that they would still get graded without penalty. But some of you try to use that to your advantage and submit things anyway, assuming I wouldn't know the difference between one and the other. And I do know the difference. So you're still losing 11 points if you got it in late, no matter however you handed it after the 23rd, the deadline on October the 23rd. And for some of you, because of some of the other stuff that went on, some of you have zeros. Not a whole lot of people, thank goodness, but not a lot, but zeros. So there's that. Um, so don't be surprised if you see that on your assignment because there'll be reason for it. But most of you did well. Most of you did pretty well. Um, I was pleased by any number of folks who, anybody who scored an 86 or higher, I'm generally pleased with your work. Anyone who scored an 80 or higher without a curve, I'm actually, I might not be completely pleased with your work, but I'm pleased that you made your best effort. Anyone less than that, I'm kind of, not so pleased with, or in some cases disappointed with because of the way things broke down, not following instructions and so on. But again, we'll talk about that a lot more on Thursday. Um, I will, as a result of the length of time that's taken me to grade these essays, it's going to take me time to get to your freestyle assignment project proposals. That means, I have a week, right? I usually give myself a week to try to grade things. This time it's going to be 9 days, 2 days longer than I normally take. Because of the volume of things I have between 4 sets of 2 courses. So it means I'll probably start late on the proposals, but I still hope to have them done no later than the end of the day on Monday. So that you have the grades up either late Monday or sometime Tuesday or Wednesday. So in case, on the rare occasion that I have to say to someone, hey, you're going to have to change your project, um, you'll generally be okay. So I would say start working on your projects. Start working on your projects this week if you can. Please don't wait till the last minute to start. Meet with each other if you're doing groups to figure out what you're going to do. If you're an individual and you want to do research, start doing that research. Start looking up articles, pictures, music, whatever it is that you're going to do to help with this artifact project that you're working on. So don't wait for me. Start. And if I come to you and say you need to tweak this or you need to change that, then you do need to change it. But generally speaking, I don't anticipate a whole lot of people I'm saying, nope, you can't do this. Not unless it's something that is truly offensive, right? Something that is truly dehumanizing or demeaning, or something along those lines. Like your group plans on doing a blackface project and wearing blackface. That would be offensive. I wouldn't do that if I were you. And if you did decide to do it, not only would you be in trouble with me, you'd be in trouble with the university. So please don't do anything like that. Please also don't do that on Halloween night. That would be bad too. So, and racist, not to mention racist. So there's that. Um, and as far as when we're going to do virtual classes again, I anticipate doing those for sure a week from tomorrow, November the 8th, because it's election day and it's important for everyone to vote on election day, including young adults. So get out there and vote. Regardless of your political persuasion, it's a right that we should be exercising. And folks, particularly under 30, do not exercise it nearly enough. So we'll definitely be having a virtual class on November the 8th. We might do one on November the 3rd, this Thursday, but that depends on what attendance looks like tomorrow, November the 1st. I plan on, knock on wood, being in class tomorrow in person, so we will have in-person class tomorrow, and so there's that too. So I'm going to spend the bulk of the remainder of our time on this video talking about the week 9 lectures and what to do week 9. We are slightly behind. I had planned on starting working on the early civil rights movement in conjunction with the Cold War on Thursday, but I wanted to leave time to talk about things that were coming up and to talk about things that we'd already been doing. So that as a result, we're probably about half a lecture behind. We'll catch up this week and next week in the process of that. But really, doesn't matter where we are. This week is dedicated to the civil rights movement and the civil rights era and the consequences or the response or the backlash, the counter movement that have started that still are with us as a result of the civil rights era. Here's the main thing to understand. People act like the civil rights movement is truncated to the period of time between the Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954 and, say, the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968 on Thursday, April 4th, 1968, or the meeting of black radicals to talk about, becoming part and parcel of the Democratic Party I'm in 1972, and I believe it was either Louisville or Indianapolis. I can't remember what city they did this meeting in, but either way, somewhere around there, between 68 and 72 is when the civil rights period ends. But there is no civil rights movement without the civil rights gains in the 1930s and 40s. There's no civil rights movement without the Niagara Movement, which founds the NAACP in 1909 and 1910. There's no civil rights movement without civil rights activism during World Wars One and Two, in which African Americans staged marches against lynching, sit-ins against segregation, um, boycotts against um, businesses that refused to hire them, petitioned presidents, advised presidents, were part of black cabinets or FDR and Teddy Roosevelt. There's no civil rights movement without black activism and radical white activism in the period roughly between 1870 and the 1950s. So you don't get to the Brown v. Board of Education decision without without there having been a small c, small r, small m movement around civil rights for African Americans and black equality in the period of time between roughly 1890 and 1950. It's just 1880 and 1950, or even 1870 and 1950. In other words, there was always agitation, there was always pushes, but a series of things came together in the 1950s that allowed this movement to flourish in the 1950s. Number one, U.S. status at the end of after World War II. The number one power in the world, a superpower facing off against another superpower in terms of the Cold War. And with that includes propaganda. And the biggest set of propaganda that Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact and other countries who are affiliated with either the U.S. in the First World and the Soviet Union in the Second World, what we've come to know as the Third World because of poverty, but really it's the Third World because they weren't affiliated directly with the U.S. as allies or with the Soviet Union as allies. That's how this term originally started, by the way. Um, being able to see through the hypocrisy of the U.S. being this arsenal for democracy, the leader of the free world. Well, if you're the leader of the free world, why do you have 10, 15% of your population living under Jim Crow laws or living under laws that might not be Jim Crow, particularly up north, but are, segregation, inequality? Through systemic racism, poverty, and racial capitalism, and all these other things, through the violence of lynching and everything else. Why do you have so many people living under that? Soviet Union propaganda films regularly showed race riots, regularly showed white mobs going into black communities and, blowing them up. They would reenact some of these for their audiences across the Warsaw Pact. And certainly other countries were in the newly um, decolonized countries that became independent from the British Empire, the French Empire, the Dutch, and the other European powers after World War II were able to see and say the same thing. And the U.S. had to respond to this by saying, we have to do something about this. We understand to some extent that this isn't really propaganda. This is actually fact, that the U.S. is actually oppressing several portions of its population because of systemic racism. The systemic racism has been around as long as the U.S. has been around, and even longer. So the U.S., the government recognizes that they have to do more for its black and brown citizens, particularly its black citizens, African American ones. So there's that. There's also the advent of the television and the ability to basically beam to people all around the world, and certainly across the U.S., pictures of things that are happening across the U.S. Whether it's the the Little Rock Nine, and the opening up of integration of public schools in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, whether it's the opening up of University of Mississippi to James Meredith in 1961 and 62, where the governor there says, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, right? And trying to say that we're not allowing anyone to go to the University of Mississippi who's black, but National Guard came to make sure that happened. Anyway, right? Things like that. Being able to use that medium to show how outrageous the racism was in the United States, but particularly in the Jim Crow South. Um, And then there's these organizations that have been around for a while. The NAACP, the ACLU, and a branch of the NAACP, the Legal Defense Fund, who's been fighting since the early 1930s to dismantle the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, to dismantle the idea that you can have separate but equal in an entire society, to separate white from black. Um, and their work in particular is what launches what we understand to be the official civil rights movement in the 1950s. Their work to dismantle um, the court's decision through a series of state decisions and decisions at the federal level, including the Supreme Court, to challenge the separate but equal clause of Plessy v. Ferguson with the 14th Amendment and the Fifth Amendment in particular. But by challenging the equal part, but first by showing consistently how state education departments, state legislatures, local school districts continue consistently underfunded, all black schools, segregated schools that were black. They underfunded white schools, to be sure, too. Poor white schools weren't getting a lot of money either, but they were getting, on average, 2 to 2.5 times the amount of funds per pupil that black schools were getting. This was generally across the board. It didn't matter if it was rural Mississippi or the city of Atlanta, or the only exception to that really was Washington, D.C., because the federal government ran the city. Schools were funded equally, right? Schools in DC were funded equally. Teachers are actually paid with equal amounts. They were still underfunded as a whole because public schools generally are underfunded. Were and are. That's not nothing around that's changed. But with the exception of Washington, D.C., if you went across the country, you could find this ratio pretty much anywhere in Jim Crow areas. So challenge that first. They won a whole course of decisions as to that, and then they went after the separate clause that's saying the idea that having separation between black students and white students created inherent inequality that was automatically unequal on its face, because segregation meant that blacks felt that inferiority and whites felt that superiority in systems. And as a result of feeling that, how is your education going to be very good if you already feel inferior by the time you're 5 or 6 years old? Clark's Dawes experiment, used in the court with the Brown v. Board of Education decision that eventually comes down in 1954, demonstrates that. The decision is a series of 4 cases across Virginia and the Carolinas and Delaware and Topeka, Kansas. And in the end, in 1954, through the work of Earl Warren, the new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he gets a unanimous decision out of these folks, a unanimous decision to basically say that Plessy v. Ferguson is unconstitutional, making Brown v. Board of Education the law of the land. But that's not all. That's not the end of the story. In 1956, the court comes back to try to figure out, well, how do we implement this? And in the end, the court decides in Brown v. Board of Education 2 that to go with all deliberate speed in implementing this. It means gradually, right, over time, because they knew that Southerners would be very upset, and they were already very upset. They had gotten death threats from Southerners. Southerners called the Supreme Court decision Black Monday, right? As in the dark, dark day in the history of the United States, that black people would actually be seen as equal to white people on the basis of funding for public schools, on the basis of having schools integrated so that black kids and white kids could go to the same schools, right? So that started the resistance to integration, the resistance to civil rights and equality for African Americans actually sort of obviously predates the Supreme Court decision, but comes almost immediately with the Supreme Court decision in 1954. So the civil rights movement gets kicked off by none other than Rosa Parks, of course, and Rosa Parks is part and parcel of this movement. But the thing to understand, this is the last piece to understand as far as this movement is concerned, is that Rosa Parks just didn't decide one Friday in December of 1955 that she wasn't going to sit at the back of the bus anymore. Matter of fact, she wasn't even the first black woman in Montgomery, Alabama to do this. Another black woman, actually a black girl, decided to do this. And decided to do this with the help of the local NAACP branch in 1954. They pulled this earlier in the year, like 8 or 9 months earlier. But the problem was is that they later learned is that she was pregnant, and so they did not use her case as a test case to really start a boycott. But Rosa Parks, at the time a 41-year-old woman with married woman with a couple of kids, decided with the work of the with working with the local NAACP branch, pulled essentially a stunt that would get her arrested, of course, not beaten, thank goodness, but arrested, put in jail. You see the picture of her holding her jail number, right? Because she's taking mug shots. That kicks off the Montgomery bus boycott, which lasts for more than a year. And so the Supreme Court basically rules that Montgomery Bus Company and the city of Montgomery, what they were doing in terms of segregating their buses was unconstitutional. And point of fact said that cities could not do this anywhere, not just in Montgomery, Alabama, but across the country, winning them a great victory, right? But they boycotted. They got death threats. All that happened. This is organized. And the person who helped organize it even further was one Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And so he moves forward as potential young leader at the time, because he's at this point he's like 28 years old, doing the math very quickly. He's 28. He's basically 28 years old when the Montgomery bus boycott's going 28, going on 29. And so this young, recently PhD student from Boston University who grew up in Atlanta, whose dad was the founder of a church in the 1920s, lived this relatively comfortable black middle class lifestyle, starts putting himself on the line as an activist in terms of the Montgomery bus boycott, and then moves forward, right? Culminating in things like campaigns in Birmingham, Alabama, and campaigns in across Alabama and Mississippi, right? And eventually, in 1957, they organized what's known as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a conference of black, white, and Jewish activists, from churches and from synagogues and from temples across the country, particularly the South, but across the country, to try to organize more mass protests against segregation, against Jim Crow, against these sorts of things. All of that eventually culminates in the big boycotts and marches and sit-ins in places across, from Greensboro, North Carolina to Birmingham, Alabama, and so on and so forth, pushing the federal government, because all this stuff gets televised, to eventually push for civil rights. First, there's the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which they had no meat to it. Then there's the Civil Rights Act that eventually passes in 1964, which does have a ton of meat to it. In terms of enforcement teeth that denies federal dollars to states and local municipalities across the South for segregation. The highlight, of course, of all of this is the March in Washington on August 28th of 1963. And with that March in Washington in 1963, is sort of the high point of the civil rights era. This proof that nonviolence and the idea that taking beatings from people on bridges, as John Lewis eventually does in trying to gain voting rights for African Americans, equal voting rights for African Americans in 1965, is the best way to go. But here, there are two reactions to this that are important to understand in terms of the civil rights era. One is from African Americans. Not every African American agrees that this nonviolent Gandhi-like approach, that nonviolence is always the way to go. We live in a violent society, and seeing people getting their heads bashed, and seeing 11 and 20-year-olds getting blasted with fire hoses and pushed into brick walls, or their skin is being peeled off their bodies by fire hoses is not exactly, it's working, sure, but the truth of the matter is that people are getting hurt through this. People are getting killed. The day that John F. Kennedy said that we need to do something about how African Americans to end segregation in the South, and that he was going to put forth a civil rights bill with teeth in it, was the same day that Medgar Evers was assassinated in Mississippi. That very night, the night or the night after he makes that speech, Medgar Evers is coming home. He's just some local NAACP person in Greensboro, Mississippi, gets his head blown off on his way into the door of his house where his wife and his kids are, right? That's all part of this period. So there are African Americans who are like, no, no, we need black power. We need black power now. The black power movement, in fact, grows out of the civil rights movement with people dissatisfied with symbolic change, with the nonviolent approaches. They're not advocating violence, but they're not saying, "Hey, someone's going to bash in my head. I'm going to bash their head back in." They're for self-defense, right? Which is not the opposite of nonviolence. It's just an approach that says, "I'm not going to let you bash my head in all the time." And of course, there's white backlash too, some of which we still see, and that is that there are folks who literally are part of the Southern Democratic wing of the Democratic Party who did not like where the party went. So when JFK and after his assassination, LBJ really pushed for civil rights, pushed for voting rights. That's when the exodus from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party starts. An exodus that includes their far right ideas about the way this country should be, moved them to join the Republican Party or talk of themselves of reorganizing what was once a Dixiecrat party in the 1940s again in the 1960s. A lot of the push against affirmative action, against voting rights, for gerrymandering, to support Republican ideals, are really Southern Democratic ideals that infiltrated the Republican Party since the mid 1960s. And I will spend a lot more time on this over the next few weeks, including this week.